5,000 years is a long time for a mechanism to keep working. Yet at Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3,200 BCE, it still turns on right on schedule. Near the winter solstice, a thin blade of sunrise slips through a small opening above the entrance and crawls along the passage into the inner chamber. For roughly 15 to 20 minutes, the darkness changes in a way you can actually time. Why build stone so precisely that one particular morning becomes an appointment inside a sealed room? Welcome to the Nocturne History, where mystery meets the edge of sleep. Tonight, we drift into a calm kind of investigation. Questions that don't need loud answers to feel important. Whether you're here to learn, to let your mind wander, or to settle in while the past stays quietly in view, stay close to the details. We'll move slowly, but we won't be vague. Yet we also won't pretend certainty is free. Why do some possibilities get treated like serious puzzles, while others are quietly filed away before anyone really tests them? The moment you call that a sky map, the story gets slippery. A map implies intention, a readable system, and a way to check the claim, and the ancient world rarely leaves instructions. Yet we keep meeting places that seem to point and count. Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain, the Sun Dagger at Fahada Butte in Chaco Canyon, stone circles at Nabta Playa in Egypt, even dot clusters at Lascaux that some argue echo star patterns. Many scholars treat broad connections cautiously, and some links are often labeled coincidence and set aside. But if the sky keeps leaving repeatable marks on stone, why are we so quick to treat those marks as noise? So let's name the claim we're chasing without making it bigger than it is. A sky map carved in stone might not be a picture of stars at all. It could be a relationship between rock and a repeating event in the sky. That event might be a solstice sunrise, an equinox sunset, or even a longer rhythm like the moon's 18.6-year standstill cycle that some researchers suggest at a few sites. The claim is framed, it has to point to something that can happen again in the same place under the same sky. But what would count as surviving for you? One lucky match, or something that holds up year after year? There's a second problem, and it's inside our own heads. Humans are trained to see meaning in patterns even when none was intended, and archaeology is full of tempting lines you can draw after the fact. If a landscape has 30 stones or 60 stones, some line will land on something special by chance. Skeptics are right to warn about that. Yet chance can also become a convenient exit. Anomalies overlooked, proposals set aside, questions explained away a little too quickly. Why the resistance to staying with the uncertainty when the sky itself is the most repeatable thing we have? Picture a cold plain at dawn, the ground damp underfoot, and a ring of stone ahead of you. Stonehenge is the obvious test case because the alignment is visible and public. The monument's main axis lines up broadly with the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset, and people still gather to watch those moments happen. Stonehenge wasn't built in a single burst. Construction and rearrangement stretched across many generations, roughly from around 30,000 to 2000 BCE. That makes meaning harder than the alignment. It could be a calendar, a ceremonial stage, and a seasonal meeting point all at once. So why do we keep arguing as if it must be only one? Now shift your gaze across an ocean and into the American Southwest, to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and then up to Fahada Butte. There, a spiral petroglyph sits beneath natural rock slabs in a place where light behaves like a moving instrument. In the late 1970s, researcher Anna Sofaer and colleagues documented a striking effect. Near the solstices, narrow bands of light and shadow cut across the spiral differently, as if the year is being marked without numbers. Yet parts of the interpretation, especially claims tied to longer lunar rhythms, remain debated, and the site's fragility has restricted access, which makes repeat checks harder than you'd expect. Why should a claim you can test with sunlight be so difficult to revisit? Nabta Playa, in Egypt's western desert, brings a different kind of unease: the age. The area includes prehistoric stone arrangements and signs of seasonal human activity, often dated broadly to around 6,000 to 5,000 BCE. Some researchers suggest certain stones could relate to seasonal or solstice timing, implying careful observation long before formal writing in the region. But the evidence is partial and the landscape has shifted over millennia, so critics argue we may be overrating what survives. Yet isn't that exactly when caution should mean more testing, not less? Why treat "we're not sure" as a reason to stop looking? Then there's Lascaux in France, roughly 17,000 years old, where the cave walls carry animals, symbols, and clusters of dots. Some propose that certain dot patterns correspond to star groupings, and the idea is tempting because it would push sky symbolism deep into the Paleolithic. Matching dots to constellations can become a game you can always win if you try long enough, so specialists warn against confident claims. Yet if the idea is so weak, why does the argument keep returning? Why do similar star dots claims appear around other cave art discussions too? And why does the conversation so often end with a shrug, explained away as coincidence, before anyone asks what a fair test would look like? So here's the honest tension. The sky is repetitive, stone is durable, and humans are clever, yet interpretation is fragile. The standard academic move is caution, and that caution protects us from fantasy. But caution can also harden into closure, probably coincidence, probably ritual, probably unrelated, and the file closes with a sigh, as if the question was never worth the trouble. Dismissal isn't the same as disproof, and wonder isn't evidence either. So where is the clean line between pattern and purpose? Why are we so confident when the data is thin? And why does the simplest question, "does it repeat?" sometimes get the least patience? Picture yourself standing at a stone corridor before dawn, cold air on your face, a horizon line you can actually point to. Don't guess yet. Decide what a fair test looks like, what you would measure, what you would repeat, what you would accept as chance, and then watch what the sky does. And if the stones really are recording something, why did so many of these methods slip out of our everyday understanding? Why do some sites feel like instruments while others are treated like scenery? And if the rules are simple, why does the interpretation fracture the moment we try to read it? A strange thing happens when you try to test an ancient sky claim. The sky is dependable, but it isn't fixed in place. Solstices return every year. The moon's standstill cycle takes about 18.6 years, and Earth's slow wobble, precession, slides the star background over roughly 26,000 years. So a statement can be sincere and still be wrong, simply because time moved the target. When someone points at a ring of stones and says, "This is a sky map," the real question isn't whether ancient people cared about the sky, it's whether this specific claim survives measurement. We don't need to solve the mystery tonight. We just need rules that respect both imagination and evidence. If you look loosely, meaning appears everywhere, especially in beautiful places. A calm documentary has to earn it. What counts as evidence and what counts as coincidence? Start with repeatability. If a site is reading the sky, it should respond to a real cycle you can return to. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3,200 BCE, offers a clean demonstration. Near the winter solstice, a beam of sunrise reaches the inner chamber for about 15 to 20 minutes. That isn't a vibe. It's an event you can check again. But once you leave a mechanism that clear, proposals are often quietly filed away as interesting but unproven. Why do we shelve the question before we even agree on what proven should look like in the open air? Next, demand a clear target and a clear place to stand. Aligned to the solstice sounds simple until you ask, aligned from where, to what point on the horizon, and within what margin of error? Picture yourself at Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain, stones around you, a low horizon ahead. The main axis is often linked to summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset, but the monument was built and reworked across many centuries, roughly from 1000 to 2000 BCE. So what are you testing? The final arrangement, an early phase, or a tradition that kept changing? Why this axis, and why keep rebuilding it? However, even repeatable targets can trap us, because chance can repeat too. Give a landscape 40 stones and you get dozens of possible sight lines, and some will hit a meaningful sunrise by luck. Stronger cases look for constraints. Narrow corridors, framed notches, limited standing points, so you can't find a hit no matter where you stand. Skip that dull work and the topic becomes easy to ridicule and it gets explained away too quickly. How many lines were checked and rejected before someone chose the one that works, and what would count as a miss? Now step closer to a different kind of instrument. Light itself. At Fajada Butte in Chaco Canyon, the sun dagger effect was documented in the late 1970s by researcher Anna Sofaer and colleagues, where bands of light and shadow cross a spiral petroglyph differently near the solstices. Some interpretations also suggest longer lunar rhythms, possibly tied to the 18.6-year cycle, though the strongest claims focus on the solstice pattern. Still, the site is fragile and access has been restricted, so repeat checking isn't as easy as people assume. Why does that practical limit get mistaken for proof or disproof? A good claim should also survive independence. If an alignment is real, different teams should be able to describe the same viewpoint and get the same result without needing one storyteller's camera angle. Researchers prefer clear geometry and documented conditions. But more ambiguous ideas, like some interpretations of Lascaux cave dots in France as star patterns, remain controversial. Lascaux is roughly 17,000 years old, and dot clusters could mean something, but matching them to constellations can become a game you can always win. So, what would count as a fair match, and what would count as forcing it? Then ask the question that quietly ends most arguments. Can the claim be wrong? If someone says, "This marks the equinox," a fair approach asks for a predicted direction, a predicted date window, and a specific place to stand. If the prediction fails, the claim weakens. Many ancient astronomy stories are built so loosely they can't fail, which is why specialists sometimes dismiss them as coincidence and move on. However, dismissal isn't disproof, and not yet demonstrated isn't the same as never existed. Why not hold skepticism and curiosity at the same time? Consider Nabta Playa in Egypt's western desert, where prehistoric stone arrangements and seasonal activity are often dated broadly to around 6500 to 5000 BCE. Some researchers suggest solstice-related timing, while critics argue the evidence is fragmentary and the landscape has shifted too much for strong conclusions. A careful check might reconstruct horizon profiles, test multiple sightlines, and ask whether several stones work together as a constrained system rather than one lucky line. Yet debates like this can get stalled by difficulty instead of clarified by better tests. Why does hard to verify so often become not worth verifying? So the calm way to hold all of this is simple. Treat every site as a case file, not a verdict. Ask what repeats, what is constrained, what can be predicted, and what can be checked independently. Use careful language, could, might, perhaps, without letting caution harden into automatic closure where questions get quietly filed away by habit. We haven't proved sky maps tonight. We've built a doorway that depends on measurement, not mood. But which claims survive when you apply these checks coldly? We've built a standard tonight, not a verdict. The sky repeats, stone remembers, and our tests have to be honest about both. Which alignments survive when you measure them without romance? What did the sky actually buy a community? Food, safety, power, and who controlled that timing? Shift your gaze away from monuments and toward the people under that sky. Fields, migrations, storms, hunger, authority, and let the questions settle there. What changes when timing becomes power? In a world without printed calendars, missing the right week could cost you the year. A farmer who plants 2 weeks too early can lose a harvest. 2 weeks too late can watch seedlings die in dry soil. The sky doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't care if you meant well. So when we talk about ancient ways of reading the heavens, we're talking about survival. Why would anyone spend years memorizing the sky if the payoff wasn't real? Imagine stepping outside before dawn and feeling the air has changed. Colder, wetter, or suddenly dry in a way that makes animals restless. You don't have a forecast, only memory, and whatever your elders insist is the sign. Yet the sky is the one clock nobody can steal or break, and it keeps its schedule whether you're watching or not. If you're responsible for food stores for 50 people, why wouldn't you look up for patterns you can repeat? Take the Nile Valley, where the flood cycle shaped life for thousands of years. People watched sunlight and stars, and later Egyptian texts and tomb ceilings show the night sky was organized and remembered. Even without written charts, you can turn the heavens into a timetable. The sun's shifting rise point, the lengthening day, the return of certain stars in the same season. Still, this is often described as myth first and measurement second, quietly filed away as symbolism. Why do we assume symbolic can't also mean practical scheduling? Step into a voyaging canoe in the Pacific and let your eyes adjust to the dark. Polynesian navigators used star paths along with swells and wind cues to travel across hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers long before compasses. The point isn't that every route was effortless. It's that repeatable patterns were good enough to bet lives on. But this kind of skill still gets waved off as instinct, as if training can't exist without paper. Why does oral knowledge get explained away as luck? Weather raises the stakes even higher because timing errors turn into hunger fast. In monsoon regions or on desert margins, the difference between soon and now can decide whether a community eats. The sky becomes a survival dashboard, imperfect, but better than guessing. Yet when archaeologists notice seasonal alignments or recurring motifs, those hints are often set aside as coincidence unless the evidence is loud and simple. Why does the evidence have to shout before it's allowed to count? At the same time, the sky doesn't just feed people, it organizes people. Ritual timing often decides power, because the group that controls the schedule controls gatherings, labor, and legitimacy. If you can anticipate a solstice, you can choose the day everyone shows up. If you can announce the season's turn, you can look like you command it. But is that manipulation or leadership in a risky world? Why would anyone surrender control of time if control kept the community steady? Think about eclipses, because they expose the gap between fear and prediction. Solar eclipses are rare and dramatic, and without warning, they can feel like a rupture in reality. Yet ancient observers in places like Babylonia recorded eclipses and other sky events with patience, and later scholars recognized repeating patterns such as the Saros cycle of about 18 years. Still, ancient sky knowledge gets flattened into superstition and dismissed too quickly, as if the careful record-keeping doesn't matter. Why dismiss the notebook just because the language around it was religious? This is where primitive becomes a lazy label. You don't need advanced math symbols to notice the sun rises in a different place along the horizon across the year, or that certain stars return after a long absence. Repetition teaches the eye, and communities teach repetition. But we talk as if precision begins with metal instruments, as if careful watching is impossible without modern tools. Why are we so certain the past couldn't be both symbolic and exact? Consider Nabta Playa in Egypt's western desert, with prehistoric stone arrangements and seasonal activity often dated broadly to around 6,000 to 5,000 BCE. Some researchers suggest parts of the layout could relate to seasonal timing. Critics argue the evidence is fragmentary and easy to overread after millennia of shifting sand. That uncertainty is real, yet it also means the hardest work is the least glamorous. Reconstruction, measurement, repeated checking, and funding is scarce for slow verification. Why do our hardest cases so often get the least patience? And timing knowledge doesn't have to look like astronomy to function like astronomy. It can hide inside routines: when to move animals, when to store grain, when to gather, when to marry, encoded in story and ceremony, not equations. Yet once the practical context fades, what remains gets treated as quaint folklore, and the engineering is explained away as coincidence. Why do we keep separating culture from calculation as if they can't be the same thing? Let this settle before we rush to conclusions. The sky repeats, seasons turn, and people build life around what they can predict. But prediction has to live somewhere. Inside memory, inside story, or inside stone, and memory breaks. What happens when stories change, when power shifts hands, when the old schedule is forgotten? Picture yourself at a stone passage at first light, watching a thin line of sunrise creep forward. If time can be marked without numbers, how many calendars are we walking past without recognizing them? Why do some places feel like instruments rather than monuments? Now step into the stonework itself and watch how light and shadow do the writing. In the late 1970s, researchers at Fajada Butte in Chaco Canyon described something that feels almost too simple. 3 natural rock slabs, a spiral carving, and a thin blade of light that shifts position as the year turns. No gears, no ink, nothing you can wind. Yet sunlight behaves like a pointer, returning around the solstices in a way you can watch. Why carve a spiral where light is that precise, unless you expected the sky to do the writing? The mechanism matters more than the story. Stone doesn't need star pictures to become a calendar. It only needs a setup where a repeating event, light, shadow, sunrise position, lands in the same place at the same time. The sky supplies motion, the structure supplies memory, and still, stone calendar gets treated as superstition, quietly filed away as myth. Why assume ritual can't also be a measurement routine? Start with the smallest clock, a shadow. Put a straight stick in the ground, a gnomon, and watch the shadow swing and stretch. Winter shadows run longer. Summer shadows run shorter. The extremes return on schedule. You don't need math to notice it, only patience. But if patience can feed you, why would anyone call the method primitive? Now scale that stick into architecture, because stone keeps its shape when memory fails. At Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3200 BCE, a roof box lets a narrow beam of sunrise reach the inner chamber for roughly 15 to 20 minutes near the winter solstice. It's a hard yes/no trigger. Either the light reaches the target or it doesn't. Why build a switch that strict unless the date mattered enough to lock into stone? Still, chance is always waiting in the background. A passage points somewhere, the sun rises somewhere, maybe you got lucky. But how constrained is the setup? How many viewpoints work? How wide is the window? If a site offers 60 possible sightlines, how many hits should happen by accident? and how many misses get ignored because they're boring. When critics dismiss a match as coincidence, is it careful counting, or is the pattern explained away too quickly? Picture yourself on Salisbury Plain at dawn, facing Stonehenge with a low, open horizon. The main axis is often linked to the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset, and people still gather to watch. Yet Stonehenge changed over centuries, roughly from around 3000 to 2000 BCE, so the clean one-purpose story doesn't fit well. Is the alignment the point, or just one layer among many? And why does complexity get used as a reason to stop asking? Some of the strongest calendar tricks look like nothing at all, which is why they're easy to overlook. A narrow slit can turn a broad sunrise into a precise beam. Two stones can frame a line that only makes sense from one standing point. A notch can select a single day the way a pinhole selects a single ray. None of this requires writing, but it does require planning. Someone had to notice the cycle and build a filter. Why do we undervalue subtle design just because it doesn't photograph like a monument? Step closer to Fajada Butte again because it shows how fragile verification can be. The sun dagger observations depend on a particular arrangement of slabs and a particular spiral, and access has been restricted because the site is vulnerable to disturbance. That makes repeated checks harder than people assume, and broader lunar interpretations remain debated. Yet practical limits can become intellectual limits. Claims get set aside because they're inconvenient to recheck. Why does hard to verify so often become not worth discussing? If you want to see how fast a narrative can harden, look at El Castillo at Chichen Itza, where light and shadow near the equinoxes can create a serpent-like pattern along the staircase. Visitors gather, and the story becomes certainty, even while scholars debate how precise the intended effect really is. Why do some claims become famous overnight, while quieter mechanisms end up as footnotes? So here's the calm summary. Choose a repeating sky event, build a physical filter that turns it into a clear signal, and let stone preserve that filter across generations. It's a long-term instrument, even if the culture around it was spiritual. Modern habits split science from ritual, but dismissal isn't disproof, and symbolic doesn't mean random. And once you understand the mechanism, a new question creeps in. If one place can do this, why wouldn't many places do it? Imagine a wide desert where the horizon is clean and the sun's path is easy to track, and let your gaze settle on stones that look almost too modest to matter. If calendar logic shows up in Ireland, Britain, the American Southwest, and Mesoamerica, why would it stay local? Why wouldn't pastoral camps and seasonal gathering sites build their own versions with whatever they had? Now step toward Nabta Playa in Egypt's western desert, where some researchers see seasonal timing and others see randomness in fragmentary remains. If people were planning alignments that early, what were they timing? Rain, grazing routes, gatherings. Why do we assume the earliest circles were just symbolic and move on? And what else did they design that we no longer recognize because we don't know where to stand or what day to watch? Around 6000 to 5000 BCE, in Egypt's western desert, people placed stones in a basin that today feels empty and harsh. It lies far from the Nile, and it only held water when seasonal rains arrived. Yet the stones were arranged with enough intention that some researchers think they relate to seasonal timing, possibly the summer solstice. If that's even partly true, it pushes working sky alignment thousands of years earlier than the later famous monuments. Why build a time marker in a place that looks like it was never meant to hold life? Nabta only makes sense if you rewind the desert. In the early Holocene, parts of the Sahara were wetter, and seasonal lakes, playas, filled and vanished on a cycle people could learn. Water appears, grass follows, animals gather, people return. But the clues are scattered and easily damaged, and the whole story is often treated as a footnote. Interesting, then quietly filed away. Why do we act like a greener Sahara is trivia when it changes the entire logic of why anyone would gather here at all? Picture yourself at the edge of a shallow lake that won't last. The ground is cracked at the edges, softer near the center, and for a short season the air smells like wet earth. You're not building for strangers in the distant future. You're building for the next return. Yet how do you make next return predictable when you don't have paper dates or a fixed calendar hanging on a wall? Wouldn't tying your schedule to the one thing that repeats cleanly, the sky, feel practical rather than mystical? As soon as you say solstice, the pushback arrives, and it isn't unreasonable. Stones can be rearranged, sightlines can be cherry-picked, and alignments can be found if you search long enough. That caution protects us from fantasy. Yet caution can also become a quick exit, and Nabta is sometimes dismissed as coincidence or set aside because it's hard to test cleanly on a fragmentary site. Why the resistance to careful verification when the claim is simple in principle? Stand here, check the horizon, repeat. One problem is that Nabta isn't a single neat circle with a signboard explaining what to think. It's a broader landscape of features, stone settings, activity areas, and evidence of repeated use over time rather than one dramatic construction event. That layered reality makes it easier to shrug and move on because it doesn't hand you one obvious purpose. But real human life is layered too, so why should a real site feel tidy? Some interpretations link Nabta to pastoral life, people moving with cattle, timing movement around water and grass. In that context, timing isn't an abstract hobby, it's survival. Yet a seasonal marker doesn't need to be perfect to be valuable. It only needs to beat guessing by a few weeks. If a stone arrangement helped groups return to the basin at the right moment, why wouldn't it look modest and utilitarian rather than grand? There's also a social edge that can make people uncomfortable. Even a simple calendar creates power, because the person who reliably predicts timing gains influence, who decides when to move, when to gather, when to hold a ceremony, when to trade. That doesn't require manipulation. It's just how incentives work. But talk of timekeeping as authority is often waved off as too speculative, as if early societies couldn't organize around schedules. Why do we underestimate the politics of timing when timing decides who eats? To keep ourselves honest, it helps to compare Nabta to later sites without flattering it. Stonehenge has a widely discussed solstitial axis and a huge cultural footprint, but it also sits in a landscape full of possible lines and centuries of rebuilding. Newgrange has a tighter yes-no light trigger, but it's much later and built as an enclosed mechanism. Nabta is older and open to the elements, which means parts of it are easier to lose and harder to read. Yet does harder to read mean not real, or does it just mean not convenient? This is the deeper methodological problem with very early sites. They rarely get the benefit of long, expensive, repeat visits that would settle arguments. Remote locations, fragile remains, and the sheer difficulty of reconstructing ancient horizons can slow the work to a crawl. Nothing about that suggests a cover-up, but it does mean promising questions can be overlooked and sometimes explained away too quickly, simply because nobody can afford to keep returning. Why do we treat not enough study as if it equals nothing there? And there's an even quieter loss we don't talk about enough. If people in 6000 to 5000 BCE were marking cycles, not all of their instruments would survive. Wood rots, lines in the sand vanish overnight, lightweight shelters leave almost nothing. Stone is what remains, because stone is stubborn. But if only stone survives, are we mistaking what lasted for what existed? Why expect the earliest calendars to survive in clean, museum-ready form? Let the mystery settle into its calm shape. Nabta doesn't have to be a flawless observatory to matter. It only has to show that people were thinking in cycles, water cycles, grazing cycles, seasonal returns, long before famous monuments dominate the conversation. Yet because the evidence is incomplete, the debate stays messy, and messy debates are easy to wave away. Why are we so confident that messy evidence means empty evidence? Imagine the year turning at a low, clean horizon, stones at your feet, a basin that will soon fill and then vanish again. If a community learned to time its life by the sky this early, what did that do to their choices? Where to travel, when to gather, who to trust? And if we're missing the instructions, are we also missing the simplest part of the design, the exact place you were meant to stand and the exact day you were meant to watch? Now step into a different kind of certainty. Stone architecture that activates with light so cleanly you can time it in minutes. Shift your gaze from the open desert to a narrow passage in Ireland where one sunrise each year reaches into a chamber like a switch being turned. Why build something that only wakes up for a moment? And what did that moment mean? Around 3200 BCE, in Ireland's Boyne Valley, people built a mound of stone and earth that still behaves like a working device. Near the winter solstice, sunrise sends a narrow beam through a small opening above the entrance, often called the roof box, and the light travels down the passage until it reaches the inner chamber. It can last only minutes, roughly 15 to 20, and then the chamber goes dark again. 5,000 years is a long time for any mechanism to keep functioning, yet this one still fires under the right conditions. Why would anyone invest that much effort for a signal that appears so briefly? What makes Newgrange unsettling is how clean the test feels. No secret text is required, no modern tool has to interpret it. You wait for the right morning, and either the beam reaches the chamber or it doesn't. For most of the year, it doesn't. That makes the site feel less like decoration and more like an ancient yes/no switch operated by the sun. And yet when people explain it, they often jump straight to a comfortable label, ritual, and stop there. Why does that word get used like a full explanation instead of the first clue? Picture yourself outside before dawn. The mound is silent, the air cold, and the passage ahead is black. The first light doesn't pour in. It threads in, controlled by stone, as if someone built a filter for one specific moment. Builders without modern optics still manage to shape a light path this precise, which is hard to do by accident. But why choose the darkest turn of the year as the moment worth locking into architecture? A practical answer is timing. The winter solstice is a pivot point. After it, days begin to lengthen again, slowly at first. If you live close to Shoreditch, that shift matters psychologically and logistically. A group that can mark the turning of the year can coordinate decisions, when to conserve, when to gather, when to plan for the return of longer days. Still, modern discussion often treats ancient timekeeping as symbolic, unless it comes with numbers on a tablet. Why assume a calendar must be written to be useful? At the same time, the practicality story doesn't fully satisfy because Newgrange isn't a simple marker on a hill. It's a major construction project, a passage tomb built with planning, labor, and long-term coordination. That scale pushes the question towards social meaning. Who controlled the design? Who decided where the roof box would aim? If a community gathered for the moment the chamber lit up, that gathering itself could become authority. Authority to define the year, to set communal rhythm, to anchor belief in a visible event. Yet those power dynamics are often quietly filed away as too speculative, as if timing can't be political. Why the resistance to admitting that controlling the calendar can mean controlling the group? Now step inside the idea that the light may not have been for the living alone. This is a tomb, and the solstice sits in the deep part of winter. A beam reaching the inner chamber could have signaled renewal, continuity, or a relationship with ancestors. But if we call it symbolic, do we accidentally drain it of function? Why do we keep separating meaning from mechanism as if a spiritual act can't also be a precise, repeatable observation? Newgrange also forces a discipline on our investigation. This isn't a vague maybe alignment you can argue into existence. The claim is repeatable. You can return and watch whether the beam reaches the inner chamber under solstice conditions. If it fails, the claim weakens. If it succeeds again, the mechanism stands. That's rare in archaeoastronomy discussions, where people sometimes draw lines across landscapes until something fits. Even so, when broader implications come up about planning, knowledge, and intentional design, those conversations are often set aside, overlooked, or explained away as overreach. Why accept the mechanism, but refuse to explore what it implies? Notice what Newgrange does not do. It doesn't tick daily. It doesn't mark every month. It doesn't offer a busy schedule of signals. It selects a narrow window around one turning point and makes that window undeniable. That selectiveness feels intentional, and intention raises stakes. If you were building a practical calendar, why not add more markers? Why concentrate effort into a moment that lasts minutes? Why build a device that works only when the year is at its darkest? Here's where the skepticism enters, and it should. Humans love neat stories, and neat stories spread fast. People can romanticize a phenomenon and inflate it into certainty. But Newgrange isn't just a story. It's an engineered arrangement, and engineering constrains coincidence. The roof box is not a random crack. The target is deep inside a passage. Still, skepticism can harden into premature closure. Probably ritual, probably symbolic, probably coincidence. And the harder questions get dismissed without serious follow-up. Why do we feel such urgency to label it and move on? Ask yourself a cascading set of questions, slowly, without hype. If this was practical for whom? If it was ceremonial, who controlled access to the chamber and the story around it? If it was both, which part mattered more? Food planning, social cohesion, authority, or belief? And if the moment was predictable, did predictability itself become the point? What Newgrange gives us is a bridge between worlds. It's architecture, yet it behaves like an instrument. It's ceremonial, yet it's measurable. It's ancient, yet it still runs on the same sunrise we see today. Once you accept that stone can be positioned so light, writes, other monuments start to look different. Corridors, frames, notches, standing stones, horizon lines. But when similar logic is suggested elsewhere, it's often dismissed as coincidence or quietly filed away because verifying it is slow, unglamorous work. Why does the simplest test, return and watch, so often become the last thing people actually do? Let the conclusion settle without forcing it into a slogan. Newgrange shows that at least one ancient society built a structure that depends on a precise celestial event to complete its effect. But it doesn't tell us why that effect mattered most, and it doesn't tell us who owned the meaning. So what did those minutes feel like to the people waiting in the cold? Who stood inside, and who had to stand outside and trust the explanation? And why choose the year's darkest turning point as the moment the stone would finally open? Picture yourself stepping out of that passage and into a wider landscape where the sky isn't framed by a roof box but by an entire axis cut through earth and stone. Shift your gaze across the Irish Sea to Salisbury Plain, where a monument doesn't light a chamber for minutes. It seems to organize the turning year itself. Why do explanations keep shrinking that place to one purpose when the design suggests something larger? Around 3000 BCE, people began shaping a circular earthwork on Salisbury Plain, and for roughly the next 1000 years they kept coming back, adding, moving, and reorganizing stone and space. The monument's main axis is famously linked to the solstice. Toward the northeast, the midsummer sunrise. Toward the southwest, the midwinter sunset. On paper, that sounds almost too clean. But why would a place rebuilt across centuries keep honoring the same turning points unless the turning year was doing real work here? Picture yourself standing in the grass before dawn, facing the open line of the monument. The horizon is low enough to read with your eyes, and the air is cold enough to slow your breathing. On the right days, light appears where the layout seems to anticipate it. But if the goal were only to notice the sun, why commit to stones at all? Why not mark a notch on a distant ridge and save generations of labor? A grounded start is to admit what Stonehenge does plainly. The axis isn't just a modern line drawn on a map. It runs through meaningful features, including the heel stone and the avenue that approaches the circle. That gives the solstice idea a real-world check. You can stand, look, and see whether the sky meets the design. However, critics sometimes wave it away as inevitable, as if any large arrangement will catch something important by chance. Why is dismissal so fast when the alignment is visible, repeatable, and built into how you enter and face the site? The harder part is that Stonehenge isn't one thing. It's phases. Early features like the Aubrey holes, later movements of bluestones, and the final dominance of large sarsens suggest an evolving project rather than a single moment of intention. That matters because a long-lived monument can carry layered purpose without losing its anchor. Yet popular explanations keep shrinking it to one function: calendar, temple, cemetery, as if complexity is a flaw. Why does a site that lasted centuries get treated like it was designed for one sentence? Many mainstream interpretations emphasize burial and ancestry, and there's real support for that because funerary activity is part of the story. But even if Stonehenge was tied to death and memory, the solstice axis remains stubbornly present. Why link rites of the dead to the year's turning points unless time itself mattered to the living? And if time mattered, why do we keep acting like ceremony and schedule belong in separate boxes? Now widen your view beyond the stones, because Stonehenge sits inside a broader landscape of related monuments. Nearby are places like Durrington Walls and Woodhenge, and long earthworks like the curses cut across the plain. That wider layout raises a different question. Are we looking at a single monument or a designed environment? Routes, gathering points, boundaries, and focal lines that guide movement and attention? But if the landscape is part of the design, why do so many explanations treat Stonehenge like a lone object in an empty field? There's a grounded reason solstice markers matter without turning into fantasy. Solstice days are predictable anchors in a year where weather shifts unpredictably, and predictable anchors are useful for coordinating people. Evidence at Durrington Walls is consistent with large gatherings and feasting, which makes seasonal assembly plausible as a social function. Yet the gathering idea often gets treated as a soft add-on, while the monument is described as if it existed in isolation. Why do we overlook the social calendar when the archaeology keeps hinting that people came together at scale? Still, skepticism has to stay sharp. With enough stones and enough possible sight lines, a few lines will hit something special by chance, and humans are excellent at overfitting patterns. That's why the strongest claims involve constraints. Limited viewpoints, deliberate approach paths, repeated alignment logic across key features. Stonehenge has constraints, but it also has layered construction. And layered construction is where debates get quietly filed away as too messy. Why do we treat messiness as permission to stop asking questions? Another tension hides in the engineering. The sarsen's are massive, and the bluestones likely came from Wales, which implies transport, coordination, and repeated investment. That scale suggests Stonehenge mattered beyond casual symbolism. But if the entire point were one solstice line, wouldn't a simpler marker do? Why maintain a place across generations unless it functioned as more than a pointer, as a stage where something important had to happen? This is where one-purpose answers start to feel cramped. A calendar can also be a political religious theater. A theater can also be a mechanism for alliance-making, dispute settling, and identity. Who belongs, who attends, who stands where. Most researchers resist single-story certainty, and that caution is valuable. Yet popular retellings often demand one clean label, and everything else gets explained away as speculation. Why are we so uncomfortable saying it might be several things at once, when the monument itself is the product of several centuries? Try a simple cascade of questions and don't rush the answers. If this was a calendar for what? Planting, migration, gathering, ritual timing? If it was a cemetery, why tie it to the sun's extremes at all? If it was a stage, what exactly was performed here? Feasts, vows, transfers of authority, rites for the dead, all of the above. And if it was a system, why do explanations keep shrinking it to one purpose as if the rest can be ignored? Let your mind settle on the quiet center of it. Stonehenge doesn't only occupy space, it organizes time. The solstice axis makes the turning year visible, and the surrounding landscape suggests people used that visibility to coordinate something larger than a sunrise moment. But what exactly was coordinated? Food timing, alliances, funerals, authority, belief. And if the full design was larger than any single function, why do so many accounts keep compressing it until the system disappears? Picture yourself standing on that axis line as the light changes. Then turn away from the open horizon and look for smaller, more fragile instruments that don't survive crowds, weather, or neglect. Now step into a canyon where a spiral and a few slabs of stone can turn sunlight into a moving mark. If a monument can organize a year, can a blade of light do the same? Shift your gaze toward Fajada Butte and ask the quieter fear underneath all of this. If these devices are real, how easily can they be lost, restricted, eroded, or quietly filed away before we even agree on what we're seeing? In the late 1970s, researchers on Fajada Butte in Chaco Canyon described something that feels almost too clean to be true. 3 rock slabs, a spiral carved into sandstone, and a thin blade of sunlight that shifts across the spiral as the year turns. No gears, no numbers, no moving parts you can touch. Yet the light behaves as if it's following a schedule. If the sky can write on rock this precisely, why does the story instantly split into believers and skeptics? The setting matters as much as the effect. Fajada Butte rises above Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico, a landscape already marked by big decisions. Great houses like Pueblo Bonito, planned spaces, and a sense that people here built with intent. The sun dagger sits inside that larger Chacoan world, and if a society could coordinate construction on that scale, why wouldn't it also create smaller instruments that only show themselves on the right day? Picture yourself near the spiral, watching how the slabs create narrow gaps. This isn't a sealed corridor like Newgrange. It's open air, with wind, temperature swings, and stone that can shift over time. That exposure is the unsettling part. The device is fragile, yet it worked long enough for anyone to notice. But if it's that easy to disturb, how many similar setups vanished before anyone could record them? The core claim is simple and in principle testable. Near the solstices, light and shadow interact with the spiral in distinct ways, patterns you can watch rather than merely imagine. Anna Sofer and colleagues documented the phenomenon and argued it was meaningful. However, once the conversation expands to longer cycles, like the moon's roughly 18.6-year standstill rhythm, the debate tightens because you can't casually recheck long-cycle claims. If a claim takes decades to test properly, what level of confidence is fair? This is where the fair test becomes awkward, because the sun dagger can't be handled like a lab demo. Sensitive sites may be restricted to prevent damage, and that protection is responsible. Yet restrictions also mean fewer repeat observations and fewer independent confirmations. Why does a phenomenon that depends on repeatability end up in a situation where repeating it is difficult? There's also the human problem, and it cuts both ways. People are pattern hungry, and a spiral invites meaning even before the light arrives. A skeptic can look at the slabs and say, "Rocks fall like that," and the whole idea gets explained away too quickly. But dismissal isn't disproof, and excitement isn't evidence either. So what would careful, boring rigor look like here without turning every shadow into a message? To stay honest, separate the questions. First, does a distinct light and shadow pattern reliably appear near key solar dates from a specific viewpoint? Second, is it stable enough across years to be more than a lucky arrangement? Third, even if it's real, what was it for teaching, ceremony, coordination, authority, or several at once? Yet discussions often jump straight to meaning, and when the meaning argument gets messy, the entire file gets quietly filed away. Why does uncertainty about purpose erase the possibility of a mechanism? Chaco Canyon helps because the region already shows planned relationships between built space and experience. Pueblo Bonito's scale suggests coordination and repeated tradition, not improvisation. Large communal spaces like Casa Rinconada show how attention could be guided without a written script. If we accept intentional design in architecture, why resist the possibility of intentional design in seasonal light? At the same time, the sun dagger teaches a harsher lesson. Knowledge can disappear even when a site still exists. A slab shifts a few centimeters. An edge erodes. A viewing spot changes. Documentation is incomplete. Access stays limited. And a once testable claim becomes harder to settle, not because anyone is hiding anything, but because time is relentless. How many almost instruments have been overlooked simply because the evidence didn't survive in a clean, repeatable form? There's also a storytelling incentive. The dramatic version spreads fastest, while the careful version, some observations look consistent, other interpretations remain debated, verification is constrained, spreads slower. That gap makes professionals cautious, and sometimes the safest move is to avoid the topic entirely. But if caution hardens into silence, the silence raises its own questions. Why does the conversation keep collapsing into extremes instead of staying with what can actually be checked? So here's the calm way to hold it. Treat the sun dagger like a case file, not a verdict. The strongest part is short-cycle solar timing you can attempt to verify. The weakest part is anything that can't be repeatedly checked or clearly falsified. Caution is valuable. Yet caution can also become premature closure. Probably coincidence, probably overrating, and then the file closes before slow work gets a chance. Why are we so eager to finish the story while the sky keeps offering the same test? If light can act like a moving hand, sliding into position with the seasons, how many other sites are working right now, unnoticed, because nobody is standing in the right place on the right morning? How many are dismissed as coincidence because verification is slow, restricted, or simply unglamorous? And how many survive only as half-remembered claims because the instrument was fragile and the evidence was overlooked before it could be tested again? Now step into a different kind of danger. Not a beam you can watch on a date, but dots you can match only if you already want them to be stars. Picture yourself deep inside a French cave, torchlight trembling over animals and symbols where a cluster of marks might be nothing, or might be an attempt to point at the sky. Why do these dot cluster claims keep returning, and why is it so hard to prove they mean anything at all? In 1940, a group of teenagers and their dog slipped into a cave in southwestern France and found walls covered in animals, bulls, horses, deer, painted with a confidence that doesn't feel primitive at all. Much of the art is dated to roughly 17,000 years ago, but near a few of those animals sit tight clusters of dots and short marks that look almost like someone left a note without the key. The animals feel readable, the dots don't. Why add marks that refuse to explain themselves? The moment you say stars, the floor gets slippery. Some researchers and writers have argued that certain dot clusters could correspond to star groupings, often suggestions like the Pleiades, sometimes a wider Taurus connection, because the spacing feels familiar. That could be true, and it would push sky knowledge deep into the Paleolithic. Yet, feels familiar is exactly how our brains trap us. Why do we trust recognition so fast when the cost of being wrong is so low? Picture yourself inside the cave by torchlight, because that's the original viewing condition. The flame flickers, shadows move, and your eyes keep trying to simplify what you see into something nameable. A dot cluster can look tighter or looser depending on angle and distance. But if the constellation changes when you shift your stance, is it a map or a projection? Here's the hard rule most people skip. Constellations are cultural choices, not universal facts. Two observers can look at the same sky and draw different creatures in it, and both can be certain. But modern matches usually assume our modern sky stories are the correct template. Why assume an Ice Age mind would group stars the way we do? And why be so confident about it? Most archaeologists stay cautious, and that caution isn't anti-mystery. Dots can be many things: tallies, emphasis marks, abstract signs, technique traces, or symbols tied to stories we no longer have. And star map claims are often difficult to falsify. Someone can always propose a new match, so they're frequently dismissed as coincidence and set aside. However, set aside can turn into quietly filed away, and then nobody builds better tests. Why does messiness so often end the conversation? So, what would a fair test even look like here? What would convince you it's not random? What would prove you wrong? If dots really point to the sky, we'd expect constraints: repetition across multiple caves, consistent pairing between certain animals and certain dot patterns, or placement that looks deliberate rather than scattered. But do we see those constraints, or are we inventing them after we've already decided we want stars? There's another complication that gets ignored in the fast version of this story. The sky changes over long time. Precession shifts the star background over roughly 26,000 years, and 17,000 years is not a small gap. That doesn't erase the possibility of sky symbolism, but it makes a confident one-to-one match to modern charts much harder to defend. Still, popular retellings talk as if the heavens were a fixed poster and the cave is a direct copy. Why skip the one fact that makes the claim harder? And yet, the idea keeps resurfacing. Lascaux, then other caves, then other dot clusters, then another confident diagram. That repetition is the sharpest question in this chapter. If you want stars badly enough, you can find them anywhere, which should make you suspicious. But why do dot cluster star claims keep appearing across different sites? Are they all coincidence, or are we looking at a shared habit that isn't astronomy in the modern sense? A calmer middle possibility is that the dots relate to time without being a literal star chart. A cluster could mark a season when certain animals move. A set of marks could track moons, hunting returns, or gathering intervals. That kind of encoding would still look like just dots to us because we've lost the cultural key. But debates often collapse into extremes. Either it's a precise sky map or it's meaningless decoration, and the nuance gets overlooked or explained away too quickly. Why do we keep treating the middle option as unsatisfying? This is where dismissal cuts both ways. If scholars push back hard on star matching, it can sound like gatekeeping. But if we accept any match that looks right, we turn evidence into a storytelling contest where everything can be made to fit. The honest position sits in the uncomfortable middle. Keep the question open, keep the standards strict, and admit uncertainty without pretending it's a final answer. Why is "we don't know yet" so hard for both sides to tolerate? Let this case file settle into one clean warning. Seeing a pattern is not the same as proving a pattern. Lascaux may not be a sky map at all, and it may be something subtler: time, counting, teaching, memory. But if similar dot cluster arguments keep reappearing across caves, what are we missing in the way we test them, and what would a real decoding method look like? Picture yourself stepping out of the cave and into open air. Now step into a valley in northern Italy, Val Camonica, where marks aren't painted in darkness, but carved into rock by the thousands. If the map becomes a symbolic language rather than a literal chart, what counts as decoding and what turns into storytelling? In northern Italy, there's an alpine valley where stone behaves less like scenery and more like a stubborn archive. Val Camonica contains over 140,000 recorded engravings: people, deer, plows, weapons, grids, and tight geometric signs cut into rock across thousands of years, from prehistory into the Roman period. It became UNESCO's first Italian World Heritage Site in 1979, which sounds like a clean ending. But when you stand in front of a crowded panel, it doesn't feel like an ending at all. Why would generation after generation return to the same surfaces even after those surfaces were already full? This case file breaks our usual sky stone expectation, because nothing here visibly turns on with a solstice sunrise. The images don't move, they don't cast a timed beam, and they don't come with a legend explaining how to read them. That makes the danger immediate. If we want to code badly enough, we can invent one. So the question shifts from "is the mechanism real" to "what counts as decoding when the map is symbolic?" And if the meaning was obvious to the makers, why does it slip through modern fingers so easily? Picture yourself at Newgrange, near Capo di Ponte, where glacial rock lies open under trees and the carvings sit at your feet like a floor full of sentences. You see processions of stick figures, then dense scenes of bodies and weapons, then shapes that resemble fields or fences when viewed from above. But your brain keeps searching for a key, and the search is biased. You favor what looks familiar and downgrade what resists easy labels. Why should your sense of recognizable decide what counts as language and what counts as noise? One surface often pulls people toward a literal reading, the so-called Bettolina map, a panel of rectangles and lines commonly compared to land parcels and paths. Some scholars have treated it as a rough topographic sketch. Others argue it could be a ritual diagram, a social claim, or an ordering of space that isn't meant to guide your feet the way a modern map does. However, public retellings often collapse into extremes. It's a map, case closed, or it's coincidence, move on, and careful uncertainty gets quietly filed away. Why do we demand certainty from a carved surface that never promised to be a blueprint? Then there are the great engraved boulders at Semo, heavy stones marked with large figures and weapon-like shapes that feel public rather than private. They don't read like quick doodles. They read like something meant to be revisited, maybe even performed in front of witnesses. But public still doesn't tell you function. Is this a record of oaths, a warning, a boundary signal, a seasonal gathering marker, or several roles layered together? And if timing mattered, why carve scenes and symbols instead of a simple tally anyone could count? A lot of the busiest scenes in Valcamonica are often linked to later phases, especially the Iron Age, when farming, conflict, and identity were intense and visible. That matters because a language can evolve, and this valley isn't one frozen moment. It's a long conversation that changes its vocabulary. Yet popular versions squeeze it into one universal code, and when specialists push back, the topic gets dismissed as too interpretive, as if interpretation is optional in human communication. Why does interpretive get treated like a reason to stop when meaning is the whole point of marks? Mainstream caution is understandable here because symbols can lie. A circle with rays could be a solar sign, or a wheel, or a shield. A branching line could be a tree, a root, a river, or a family. But motifs repeat, solar-like forms, processions, clustered scenes, often enough that waving everything away as random scratches starts to feel lazy. Some proposals get labeled coincidence because proving them is slow, and then the most interesting threads are explained away too quickly. But dismissal isn't disproof. So what would count as enough repetition to justify staying with the question? The Rosa Comuna, the valley's famous emblem, shows how slippery decoding can be. It's iconic today, which tempts us to treat it like a known letter, yet its original role isn't secure. Solar sign, group marker, ritual diagram, something practical or several at once. Still, instead of only asking, what does it mean, we can ask, what did it do? Did it tag a place where obligations were declared, mark a meeting season, or anchor a right time to day length? Those questions are slow to test, rarely receive sustained patience, and sometimes get dismissed without serious investigation. So why should difficulty be mistaken for absence? Here's a more careful middle ground that keeps the mystery honest. Maybe Valcamonica is not a star chart, and maybe it's not meant to be read like a sentence at all, but it could still be an encoded worldview, a way of fixing memory, status, boundaries, and seasonal life into a public surface that outlives any single speaker. That kind of system would look symbolic to us because we've lost the context, yet it could still be functional, socially, ritually, and practically. Why do we keep acting as if symbolic means decorative, as if symbols can't also be tools? And this is where the tension sharpens into a real test of discipline. If we call every repeated sign a code, we risk turning evidence into storytelling. If we call every uncertain reading just interpretation, we risk flattening a huge human record into silence. So what would a fair decoding method look like? One that can admit uncertainty, compare panels across time, and still make falsifiable predictions about what should repeat and what should not. And why do we so often replace "we can't prove it yet" with "it wasn't real"? As if the rock itself didn't exist? Imagine stepping back until the individual figures blur into one long message stretched across centuries. Now shift your gaze to the skeptic's warning, the ways patterns seduce us, and the way confidence can harden into closure. Because the next case file isn't only about ancient marks. It's about our own habits of belief. When do we stay curious, and when do we quietly file a hard question away because it's easier to move on? If you stare at a surface long enough, your mind starts handing you shapes, faces in clouds, animals in torch flicker, meaning in noise. That isn't a flaw unique to ancient mysteries. It's the same pattern hunger that makes optical illusions work and makes witnesses disagree. Yet if pattern seeking is built into us, how do we study stone and sky without turning every line into a message? That's why many mainstream researchers push back on broad sky code claims, and sometimes they're right. Give a site 40 stones and you get dozens of possible sight lines, and with enough freedom, you can discover an alignment to almost anything. But if the method is the danger, not the curiosity, why do arguments collapse into believe versus don't believe instead of predict versus test? Picture yourself with a photo of Stonehenge and a pen, drawing line after line until one points where you want. It feels convincing because it looks clean on paper. But where were you meant to stand? At the heel stone, inside the ring, on the avenue? Which stones matter, and which are just convenient anchors? And if the rules can change after every objection, can the claim ever fail? This is why constrained mechanisms matter more than pretty matches. Newgrange isn't a flexible diagram. It's a repeatable event. Light entering through the roof box and reaching the inner chamber near the winter solstice. You can watch it. You can miss it. You can return and check. Yet once we move from "does it happen" to "what did it mean?", that part is often quietly filed away as unknowable. Why do we accept mechanism but treat meaning as off-limits? Now step into the riskier territory where the instrument isn't light but symbolism. At Lascaux, some have argued dot clusters near animal figures correspond to star groups, and the temptation is obvious when the art may be around 17,000 years old. However, constellations are cultural choices, and a match can be proposed forever if no failure condition exists. So is it a sky diagram or a modern Rorschach test, and why are people so certain either way? The skeptic's warning isn't never wonder. It's watch how a method can cheat. If you allow flexible targets, flexible viewpoints, wide tolerances, and vague time windows, you can score a hit by accident. That's why careful work asks boring questions. What exact direction is predicted? What margin of error is allowed? And what would count as a miss? But why do people hear those standards as hostility, as if a test is an attack? Still, skepticism can become its own shortcut. When an idea feels messy, it can get set aside, explained away too quickly, or labeled fringe before anyone does the slow work that could settle it. That doesn't require a villain. It can be as simple as time, budgets, and risk. Field seasons are short, and maybe projects struggle to compete. But why does "we can't prove it right now" so often harden into "it wasn't real"? Consider Fajada Butte's Sun Dagger in Chaco Canyon, because it shows how a claim can be testable and still hard to resolve. The Solstice light and shadow effect was documented, yet the site is fragile and access has been restricted to reduce damage. That's responsible. Yet restrictions also mean fewer independent rechecks, and broader interpretations remain debated. When the evidence is something you can't endlessly revisit, what level of confidence is fair? Nabta Playa adds another complication. Time can erase the experiment. The landscape changed, the remains are fragmentary, and overreading is a real risk. Yet pastoral groups returning seasonally around 1600 to 1500 BCE still had to track cycles somehow, whether by horizon, stars, memory, or ritual. If early sites are hardest to verify, is it fair that the funding dries up first and the patience runs out fastest? And why do we treat hard to test as if it means not worth testing? Symbolic records bring the trap to its peak. In Valcamonica, thousands of engravings invite interpretation, but a symbol can support too many stories. Scholars are right to be cautious. Yet the opposite mistake is real too, to wave it all away as just art, as if centuries of carving happened for no reason. Why do we act like complexity argues against purpose, instead of hinting at a long, evolving purpose? Here's a credibility anchor you can keep. Strong claims take risk. They specify a viewpoint, a date window, a target, and a rule that doesn't change every time you challenge it. That's why solstice axes at Stonehenge and the roof box beam at Newgrange stay on the table even when meanings differ. Yet why do we still argue as if every claim is equally strong or equally dismissible? Let this settle. Believers can mistake excitement for proof, skeptics can mistake caution for a final answer, and brush off questions without deep follow-up. But dismissal isn't disproof, and wonder isn't evidence, so what's the sane posture in the middle? Curious enough to test, strict enough to let your favorite idea fail. And if a few stones and shadows really do repeat on schedule, how many more are possible, testable, and still left untested? Imagine standing between two instincts, the urge to make the past magical and the urge to make it dull. Now step toward the only useful closing question. Across all these case files, what survives careful testing without losing the mystery? Shift your gaze across the evidence and ask it plainly. Were these ideas independently invented, widely shared, selectively guarded, or partly lost in translation? And what exactly have we forgotten that the stones still hint at? One morning each year, near the winter solstice, a thin slice of sunrise reaches into Newgrange in Ireland and briefly lights an inner chamber built around 3200 BCE. A few degrees and a few minutes decide whether it happens at all. 5,000 years later, the light still arrives on schedule. That's the unsettling fact at the end of our trail. The stones still work, even when we don't fully understand what work they were meant to do. If a message can survive that long, why does its meaning feel so fragile in our hands? However, once you've seen one clear mechanism, you start noticing how many places are built around the turning year. Stonehenge's main axis on Salisbury Plain points toward solstitial sunrise and sunset, and the site's long history, built and rebuilt over many centuries, suggests it wasn't a single-purpose gadget. Nabta Playa in Egypt's western desert may be even older, often discussed around 6000 to 5000 BCE, and some researchers have proposed seasonal timing in a landscape that once had wet phases and returning herds. But if these are real patterns, why do we keep acting surprised that people watched the sky carefully? Still, the deeper problem isn't whether the sky mattered. It's that the same mechanism can wear many masks. A solstice marker can help coordinate food planning, a gathering, a rite for the dead, or a public reset of authority, and it might be all of those at once. We like tidy labels because they let us stop thinking, yet ancient life wasn't tidy. When someone says ritual as if it closes the case, what are they actually refusing to consider? Now picture the act of reading itself, because that's where we quietly drift into trouble. At Fajada Butte's Sun Dagger in Chaco Canyon, a narrow blade of light and shadow was documented in the late 1970s moving across a spiral near key solar dates. It's elegant and it's also fragile. Rock shifts, surfaces erode, access becomes restricted for good reasons. But if repeatability is the heart of the claim, what happens when the site can't tolerate endless rechecks without being damaged? Yet the most dangerous failures aren't always physical, they're mental. Lascaux, with art often estimated around 17,000 years old, tempts us with dot clusters that some have tried to match to star groups. The caution is obvious. Want stars badly enough and you can find them anywhere. Many specialists dismiss these matches as coincidence, and that skepticism can be healthy. But why does the conversation keep returning to dot clusters in more than one cave? And why do we pretend that repeated temptation tells us nothing at all? But the moment the map becomes symbolic, the ground gets even softer. In Valcamonica, with its vast record of rock engravings, tens of thousands of figures and signs, meaning is the whole battlefield. A wheel-like form might be the sun, or a shield, or a clan marker. A grid might be land, or ritual order, or a teaching device. When interpretation multiplies, people often shrug and move on, as if uncertainty equals emptiness. Why is we can't decode it cleanly treated like proof it wasn't real communication? However, the skeptic's warning isn't only about gullible believers, it's also about the comfort of dismissal. Some questions get quietly filed away because they're slow, remote, or hard to fund, and maybe doesn't compete well with safer projects. Sometimes promising lines of study stall and funding dried up, not because anyone disproved the idea, but because the work is demanding and the results aren't guaranteed. That doesn't make every claim true. But why do we let the absence of a perfect experiment become a verdict? So what remains if we refuse both extremes? The urge to declare a universal sky code and the urge to explain everything away too quickly. What remains is a pattern with edges you can touch. Certain places do create constrained events. A roof box channeling sunrise, an axis framing a solstice, a light and shadow mark behaving like a seasonal hand. Those are not moods, they are repeatable interactions between stone and sky. But if the mechanism is measurable, why does the meaning keep slipping through our fingers like sand? Part of the answer may be simple loss, and it doesn't need drama. Oral instructions break, languages shift, communities migrate, and a standing spot is forgotten even if the stones stay put. A society can remember that this day matters while forgetting why it mattered, and later observers can preserve the structure while losing the context. That's how an instrument can survive as a monument. Yet if we accept that everyday knowledge can vanish in a few generations, why are we so confident we understand what ancient knowledge couldn't have been? Let the synthesis be calm, not final. Across continents and time spans, humans kept building ways to anchor life to the sky. Sometimes with corridors, sometimes with horizons, sometimes with marks that only make sense on the right day. The stones may not be whispering one unified message. They may be showing something simpler and stranger, that measuring and meaning were never separate for our ancestors. So was this knowledge widespread, shared between groups, independently reinvented, or selectively guarded by people who controlled the calendar? And here are the questions we're left with, the ones that don't need hype to stay awake. If a few places still activate on schedule, how many more are working quietly while we're not standing in the right place? Why do some sites stay famous while others are overlooked because they're harder to test? And if the sky was the most dependable clock humans ever had, why wouldn't it leave traces everywhere? Some obvious, some hidden, some lost in plain sight. We've moved through deep time together in the nocturne history, and we never forced the past to give us neat answers. If you stayed with the uncertainty, you did the hardest part. You let questions remain open without turning them into fantasies. Now let the thought settle. Let it rest. You can drift with the idea that the world is older, quieter, and more intentional than it appears. When you close your eyes, listen for the soft hum of cycles returning, sunrise, season, year, and feel how much of human life was built to match them.